Alright guys, so it's Dr. Colino here. Hope you all had a good weekend, and sorry about the delay of posting this video, but just really want to take the time and come up and give you a good video. So just starting more or less where we left off last time, is that I was hoping for the next class that you've read the above paper and come prepared for just a group discussion next class. So basically, the question is, what do the segmented reaching trajectories in infancy tell us about the coordination across the joints of the arm? So if you want to read that paper and that I posted on Course Spaces, that would be great. So let's talk about the development of reaching. So we know that visual information does play a really important role in reaching and grasping. And this is the same with young infants. So I'm going to make a distinction before we move on between visually triggered reaches, and these are reaches in which visual information about the object location triggers the behavior. So, and you see this in infants up to 4 to 5 months old, and they basically just will reach towards objects to which that are presented in front of them. It's quite instinctive and not really under volitional control, if you will. Whereas visually guided reaching, where the visual information about the difference in the hand and target is used to adjust the reach and be more accurate. So for those of you who've taken EFE 380, you'll recognize this as online control. So the evidence for development of these visual guide reaches have come from experiments where you have an infant in a room, they reach towards objects where the object is lit, or if the object is dark, so that therefore they can't see it. At about 5 months, up to 5 months, infants are equally accurate whether the reach was made in the light or the dark. So the graph that you see there is just on the y-axis is the probability of an accurate first reach. Remember this. So it's the very first reach when an infant initiates the movement up towards to the end. So what I will show, I'll just turn on my laser pointer here. So you have here at around 5 months, so again on the x-axis you have age in months, and at about 5 months, infants are more or less equally likely to reach a target in the dark or in light. So whether the room is illuminated or if it's not, the lights are turned off, infants at this age are more or less equally likely to reach the target. But as infants do get older, that probability of reaching the object at their first programmed response increases up towards when an object is illuminated by at 9-11 months, infants will reach that object in their first attempt. Whereas you see the inverse pattern in a darkened room, that they still are able to reach towards, or rather, they're quite less likely to reach an object in the dark with their first attempt. And so, what we can say to summarize is that reaching without any visual feedback, the ability to make accurate reaches without visual feedback will improve. So here on the y-axis, you see that if is an undershoot or overshoot, so this is a relative measure, 0 being you're on target. Undershoot going up means if you are short of the target, or overshooting if you land your hand too far of the target. And what you see here is that at age 7, there's really this gigantic increase in errors made when making errors without visual feedback. But then that steadily improves as as a child gets older, and an adult will pretty much almost always undershoot a target, but quite close to it. They're within about a centimeter or so of the target. And in fact, for some reason, 7-year-old children apparently have an increased dependence on visual feedback. We can also see changes in the kinematic movement, in the kinematic patterns. So here, you have ballistic movements. So ballistic movements, or rather, if you talk about the ballistic kind of movements, is really simply saying that initial impulse towards moving. Whereas ballistic with smooth deceleration is you have the ballistic phase to get your arm to get your hand into the vicinity of the target, and then there's a slow deceleration with that. And finally, you have what's called a ramp and step. So you reach towards a target, and then there's a graded increase in acceleration if you need it. And as children age, there's less and less this fast ballistic movement going out to reach a target, and you see more of the ballistic and smooth deceleration. So you tend to see this movement in late childhood, and it persists even into adulthood. But then you also see this larger ramp and step. So these types of movements just simply require a larger degree of control. So meaning that you tend to see this, get your arm to the vicinity of the target and you home in. So if you're familiar with the online control portion in EFI 380, this is quite familiar to you. The effects of visual feedback control during reach is made while wearing prism goggles. So here's another example where when you're able to reach with and without prism goggles. And what prism goggles do is they simply change the apparent position of the visual space. So when you wear a goggle of this diopter here, it'll make it appear that the position of this target is right. It looks like it's to the right where it actually is. And what you tend to see is people will mistakenly reach towards the virtual position and reach towards the real position of the target. So they make this correction. At 5-year-olds tend to correct the trajectory later in the movement. 7-year-olds will correct it earlier, again, hence reflecting their increased dependency of visual feedback, and it reduces at age 9 and 11. So with 5-year-olds, just to recap, you have a late correction, so closer to target. 7-year-olds tend to have an earlier correction, and 9 to 11-year-olds, as you can see here, correct their trajectory at an intermediate level. So here you tend to see, so at age 7 you have this strong dependence on visual feedback, and by age 9 and 11 you tend to see this combined feed forward and feedback control. So the motor systems of children at age 9 and older, their feed forward systems, they're able to predict consequences, or they've laid down enough, they have enough experience that they can predict what would happen in this. And this is why you tend to see a earlier correction than compared to 7-year-olds. Okay, so let's switching gears here. We're going to talk about and just review a really important concept in motor control, and that's to do with called Fitts law. So basically all it says is that the distance between two targets, as well as how wide they are, will determine how quickly you can move between them. So 5-year-olds tend to have, so what you have here is this slope of, so slope here just tells you how quickly information can be processed, and it changes throughout childhood. So at 5-year-olds tend to have a steeper slope than say 9 or 11-year-olds. So what this means is that when targets are further apart, or they're wide, or they're narrower, it's much harder for younger children to perform this task. So they have to perform it more slowly. Whereas here, as you compare it to 11-year-olds, they can perform the same task as the 5-year-olds, but do it much faster. Hence, the movement time is shorter compared to your 5-year-olds. The cluster of dots here versus those here. And as you can see in childhood, this slope decreases with age. Oh, there we go. So once again, we'll just shift gears a bit. So this is where it becomes important to talk about the cerebellum, because the cerebellum is where you see is thought to be the center of the feed-forward mechanisms, and in fact, the cerebellum is a sensory structure. So when scientists were performing electrical stimulation of the brain, when they tried electrically stimulating the cerebellum, they didn't see any responses or any conscious sensation. So hence they called it a silent area of the brain. What it is, in fact, in reality, is a sensory structure. So the signals that the cerebellum receives, they're not conscious. So they're the ones from your muscle spindles, your tendon organs, everything you use to detect body position and joint position. That the cerebellum processes all this, and it helps for coordinating movements. So it becomes worthwhile talking about cerebellar ataxia, and here's a YouTube video link that you can go and watch a good example of it. And cerebellar ataxia has 3 important signs: dysmetria, dysdiadochokinesia, and rebound. Again, you can watch these videos at your leisure, and you'll have a good grasp of what I mean by that. So here's a brain specimen, or a picture of a brain specimen. So you can see cerebral cortex up here, some landmarks like corpus callosum. There's your thalamus and hypothalamus here. Brainstem with the medulla here and the pons. And just behind the brainstem here is your cerebellum. Okay, so in class, I like to split into groups of 2 to 4 people, and you can perform the following coordination tests, the same ones that you would have seen in the videos. So we'll do hand rapid alternating movement, finger to nose movements, and stand up and do a tandem gait. And what I'd like you to try to do is to perform these tasks as quickly and accurately as you can, and note how much coordination it requires of you to perform these. So if you want to do this yourself at home, you can go ahead and pause the video. Otherwise, we can keep going. Okay, so we talked about reaching. So reaching is about getting your hand to an object. Now, how about the grasping component? And this requires a fair bit of coordination as well. So we know that the grasping reflex is present at birth to about 2 months of age. And in fact, the voluntary control of fingers tends to emerge later in the first year, because it takes a lot of time for the corticospinal tract to develop, and for the brain of infants to be able to coordinate the movements of all the fingers, and it takes time. And when we talk about hand orientation is really important because in adults, the hand is oriented to the object as if it's appropriate to grasp it. So think of tool use. When you want to go out and grab a hammer, you're going to grab the hammer with your dominant hand in such a way that once you grasp it, it's ready for you to be used. And this hand orientation tends to appear at 4 to 5 months. So here's an example. So there's a pull bar here, so the infant grasps towards it, and they'll try to make that grasp. What you also see, and interestingly, is that in adults, the hand begins to close in anticipation of grasping the target. So here is a graph where you have grip size in centimeters, and what you tend to see is you see this typical pattern of grasping. So let's look at this solid line here, and the solid line here just shows you that you tend to see this peak grip aperture here, and you see this closing in on the target. This is a typical grasping pattern. So this is this hand closing in anticipation of the grasp. So you see this behavior at around 5 to 6 months of age. So this reflects the feed-forward control. So your brain at 5 to 6 months of age begins to anticipate how much that needs to be closed. So, and this happens before you even start grasping the object. And also that, if we go back, this aperture is scaled to target size. So when you grip aperture will be smaller for narrower objects and wider for wider objects. So a 2mm rod versus a 55mm cylinder. And this behavior tends to appear at 9 to 13 months of age. And before that time, you just simply see a power grip. So all your fingers will coordinate in unison. So they grip something in unison. There's very little independent movement or voluntary independent movement of fingers before that time. So talking about once we actually grab an object, there's a few things that your nervous system has to consider. It's the grip forces that has to be appropriate for the object you're grasping, given its weight or composition. So is the object really firm, durable, or is it quite fragile, like an egg? And you also have to consider the load forces that increase in parallel so it can be picked up. So load force is simply how much force is going tangentially on your skin when you're grasping an object. The grip force is the perpendicular force going into the object, so you can see that. So what you tend to see is a variability in younger children in the load force and the grip force. And that variability decreases with younger children, and by adulthood you tend to see this very much the scaling depending on an object size and object mass as well. So at 20 months you see very little scaling in terms of object mass, and then by adulthood this scaling you can see very clearly shows here. So when you see the scaling of grip force, it just typically means that there's one object. So these traces are from when an adult is picking up a heavier object versus a lighter object. So this very much can explain why young kids tend to drop things a lot, because they haven't learned how to appropriately adjust their grip such that an object won't fall out of their hands. So, another important concept in terms of grasping is what's called a safety margin, which is simply the ratio of the grip force to the load force. So, when you look at children, so in the x-axis you have age there, and then the safety margin. Like as I said, it's simply the ratio of grip force to load force. So for young children, say 1 to 2 years of age, children have to put in a large amount of grip force to pick an object up relative to load force. And in adults, that tends to decrease quite a bit. It tends to appear in infancy here and will decrease from 1 to 6 years of age. So as you can see, the grip force is inappropriately high for the mass of the object. So infants in effectively are exerting a lot of effort given how heavy the object is. So some importance of visual experience, that movement produced visual feedback is very important for appropriately developing visually guided reaching. So in cats here, in a cat study where cats were born and they were put this collar on such that they couldn't see their feet, such that they can't see limbs, you tend to see that normally visually triggered reaches and abnormal visually guided reaches. But if you allow 18 hours of normal exposure, the deficits disappear. So again, it goes to show that visual experience is quite necessary for the appropriate development of reaching and grasping. So if you have the inability to see your limbs, then the visually guided reaches become impaired. But after some time to readapt, then the normal behavior appears again. Also, another important question is, does the movement produce visual feedback? Does it have to be actively produced? So what do I mean by this? So in this, again, another cat study, one animal moves and both animals get the same visual feedback. So the cat here on the right is moving this merry-go-round, whereas this cat is simply passively viewing the movement. So it's actually, is there a difference in movements when that movement is actively performed versus simply you do passive viewing? So what you see in the active animal showed normal visually guided reaches, whereas the passive animal didn't. So self-produced movement is necessary for the development of visually guided behavior. So if you'd like to take a quick break now, because we did cover quite a bit, you can do so now. Okay, so let's just switch gears again, and we're going to talk about aging and limb movements. So we tend to see that movements occur more slowly the older we get, and this influences many everyday activities. For example, when you tend to see slowness a lot when the task is new or it's not well practiced, there's some uncertainty in the task, or if there's irrelevant information that needs to be ignored. Older adults are not very good at this, or the task is quite complex. Or you have cases of dual task situations. So you tend to see an increase in reaction time and movement time, and with reaction time specifically, that there are several different processes that make up reaction time that are all affected by aging. So we could look at simple reaction time, which is simply a response to a single stimulus. And here's some data that show reaction time in milliseconds on the left-hand side, and the age group in years. So what you tend to see is that as individuals, here, this top line is the median RT, whereas here's the fastest. And if we just look at the average and the median, you tend to see this increase in reaction time as one ages here. So slow reaction times at very young ages, but then it peaks at around between 20 and 29 years of age and slowly increases. So simple reaction time increases by 0.6 milliseconds a year from ages 20 to 96. And about across 50 years, that's about 50 milliseconds total. We can also look at EEG and EMG measurements. And simply what we'd like to do is we can record motor potentials, we can record visually evoked potentials from the brain or from muscles as well. So visually evoked potentials, so we could ask, well, what is it? So this is simply the brain's response recorded at the scalp that indicates a visual stimulus occurred. So you can talk about when that first occurred. And why is the time to the VEP increased in the elderly? Okay. We can also talk about motor evoked potential, which is this, that we tend to record at the very top of the head. And we could talk about the time from the VEP, your visually evoked potential, to the motor evoked potential. And we could talk, so we could think, what do you think that might represent? So your brain's response to the visual event versus your motor cortex actually sending a command. So what do you think that interval will represent? So I want you to take some time and think about that before moving on. And you can also think, why is the time from the VEP to the MP increased in the elderly? There's also something called premotor time. So premotor time is simply this silent period before you see EMG activity, so electrical activity at the muscle. And so you can say, what does the time interval from the motor potential to the premotor time represent? And why do you think that might be increased in older adults? We can also look at contraction time. So contraction time is just simply how long it takes for a muscle to contract. And we can ask, why is it increased in older adults as well? So if you like to take some time to think about that, why would contraction time be longer for older adults? And movement time as well is also slower in the elderly. So if you think back to Fitt's law, when you are able to move more slowly, you tend to be more accurate. So in young, movement time is also slower. So in young individuals, so you could look at, so keep in mind movement velocity, this scale here, versus that in the older adult data. You can see that young adults will move faster than older adults. So here's the same kind of data that I drew at the same scale as this one. And we also look at accelerations are smaller than in younger adults, or rather, accelerations are larger in younger adults than you see in older adults. So they spend more time decelerating, and there's more re-accelerations as a hand approaches the target. So this interval is longer in older adults than younger adults. And you'll see the characteristic pattern in EMG activity in agonist and antagonist muscles begins to break down. So you see agonist antagonist pairs. So when you go out and reach, for example, your triceps contract, and then so does your biceps a little bit, with some deceleration of the biceps again here. And where in elderly, in older adults, you tend to see this pattern to be more variable. So you normally see this triphasic pattern, and that pattern becomes far more variable in older adults. We can also look at choice reaction time. So this simply means you have to discriminate the stimulus and pick a response. So choice reaction times with the number of stimulus and response alternatives goes up more or less linearly. So choice RT increases with the increasing number of stimulus and response alternatives. And this increase in older adults, it's not just the motor part slowing. So you have this in this dotted line, is that what you can see in older adults here. So it's not only that, but the slope increases. So that means that stimulus discrimination and response selection is slower in older adults. You can see here. Even tracking a moving target also involves response selection. So older adults display reduced accuracy at slower target speeds than younger adults. So this occurs at speeds that are less than the maximal movement speed of older adults. So the reduced accuracy must be due to difficulties in selecting the response and especially when the target changes direction. Even the ability to modulate grip force declines. So in young adults, you tend to see very smooth grip curves, whereas in elderly, it's far more variable. So the maximum grip force in younger adults is twice as high in older adults you see than young adults. So older adults have to, again, disproportionately expend more energy to grasp at something as opposed to young adults. It could also be partially due to that older adults tend to have more slippery skin, and it also takes more time for your older adults to learn to adjust their grip force on different surfaces. Again, and this is partially due to reduced cutaneous receptor sensitivity. And eye movements. So you can think of the eye movements that we looked at that are called saccades. They're like aiming movements in such that the reaction time increases, as does peak velocity. Accuracy is the same, but again, that is because if accuracy stays the same, it's due to lower peak velocity. And we can think of smooth pursuit are like tracking movements. Reaction time doesn't change, but gain is decreased, so a larger movement needs to happen for a smooth pursuit to occur. And you have more saccades interspersed through a tracking movement. Okay, so that's everything for today. it's just to cover what we didn't manage to cover during the lecture. But thank you guys again. I will see you on Tuesday, and yeah, we'll continue on with our next topic. I will again do my best to post videos earlier, such that you'll be able to see these material at your leisure. Anyway, I hope you all have had a great weekend, and we'll see you on Tuesday.